Welcome to the Execution is King podcast, where we talk to successful startup founders, investors, and ecosystem builders to uncover insights and best practices for the next generation of great global startups. Today, I'm talking to Rob Weber, managing partner at Great North Ventures. How you doing today, Rob?
I am doing great. How are you doing, Joseph?
Good. I've been reading this new book, actually, by Andrew Chen. He runs this program called the Reforge program. He's also a venture capitalist. I applied to that program a couple times already, but I've been rejected because I work for a VC and they strictly accept startups to work on all of these like network-based digital tactics, basically for growth. But it's a really great book. I know you've read it as well.
Yeah, I think the cold start problem, I came from the consumer app, kind of social app space. And so I worked, a lot with social apps and marketplaces. And of course, Andrew Chen, who wrote the book, was kind of famously in the growth team at Uber through their rapid growth before going over to Andreessen Horowitz. And, for what it did for me was, let's say there's about an 8-year period where we were operating this business Native X, which put us kind of in collision with all these leading consumer social apps and marketplaces and games around the world. I found that book to be really clarifying in terms of a lot of the things that I remember reading about, learning from, talking to people at conferences about, how you like spin up these growth teams. How do you create this kind of growth mindset? There really is sort of a playbook for how you create these sort of multi-user kind of network-driven applications. And some of the examples of how people fake it are really interesting, like Tinder went college party to college party, just signing up people. Or these are like my favorite stories because, once they get big and they scale up and they figured a repeatable way to do that, okay, I think people just sort of think of them for what they become. Almost every one of these types of businesses had this sort of, they didn't start out with a big network effect or a big audience. So how do they break through and become one of these gigantic successes?
They had to do things that didn't scale, right? Mm-hmm. To get over the cold start problem.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I really liked in there too. It sort of kind of reminded me like, is it just like a big launch and you get a bunch of publicity? No, not really. Usually that doesn't work that well. Like normally it's about this like atomic unit. How do you create value within maybe even just 2 people to start with? The examples of big successes, generally that's kind of how they start. But this talked a lot about like, kind of the startup world, and the network kind of driven business models. But I think in this episode with Una Fox, we're going to talk a lot about kind of the network effects of just working with people and community and how your own career can kind of take advantage of network effects. And it's kind of a full circle moment for me. I think I met Una 15 years ago or so while she was an executive at Yahoo, which was our largest customer at the time at my prior startup. And we did, millions and millions of dollars of business with Una's team over maybe a span of, I don't know, it was 5 years, maybe 10 years in there. And that put me in really close contact with Una, her leadership style and the team. And so I kind of lost touch with her. I know she eventually left Yahoo. And Yahoo was a lot different company, 15 years ago than it is today. Or certainly 25 years ago, like in the 90s. Like Yahoo, people, the Gen Zers probably don't remember, they wouldn't have been around. Well, Yahoo was like a juggernaut in the internet in the 90s and early 2000s. People before Google even came on the scene, right? Like in the 90s. So you think about like, I kind of lost touch with Una as she went on to Disney, where she worked on, I think initially she was on the e-commerce team that launched marketplaces for the Disney stores. And then I think she also worked on the Disney Plus launch, which was obviously one of the most successful consumer subscription business launches of all time. And so I remember reaching out to her just to check in like 6 months ago, and we just sort of hit it off. And I think it was the trust we had built over years, while working together at Yahoo. It was almost like not missing a beat. And I found that, throughout your career, whether it's who you partner with your business, who you choose to work with and recruit to your company. Like, I think that's one of the opportunities I love about, working in business is you kind of get to pick and choose who you work with. And once you've built up that trust, it can be repeated in how you build teams, how you lead teams, who you work with. So there's a lot of this sort of network effects in business beyond just, scaling social apps.
Una Fox is the Chief Global Data and Analytics Officer at Aristocrat. Welcome to the podcast, Una.
Hey, Joseph, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Una, I know you've been a part of launching some really impressive digital businesses and initiatives at some larger companies like Yahoo and Disney. Can you kind of walk us through some of the leadership lessons that you've learned throughout your time kind of scaling these kind of digital businesses?
I've been doing this now for almost 20 years. So there's lots of different use cases and different experiences that I've been through. So when I was at Yahoo, it was really all about the ad tech experience and building out new digital products. And I was having a conversation with somebody at a Silicon Valley conference a few years ago and talking about ideas. And really, what I have seen over the course of 15 to 20 years working with different companies is that sometimes there is a product that you're working on that you have aspirations for that product, but maybe the timing's just not right. You know, either it's a B2B product or a B2C product. But even though you're making progress on building that product, the timing might not be right for the market. And then at some point, years later, you see that product evolve or it appears and the timing is right. And you think, oh my goodness, this is what we were waiting for. So when I was working at Yahoo back in '06 and '07, we started to build out a display network like we had for search. And at the time, we were trying to cobble together all of the systems that would allow us to do that, right? So basically, what we were doing was building partnerships with publishers to extend inventory, ad inventory, and impression inventory for Yahoo and also for those publishers so that we could reach consumers either if they were on Yahoo or at the publisher site or somewhere else. I think it was a great idea, it was a great concept, and we were working really hard to make it happen. And then I think a lot of those people, technology people, left and they ended up starting the DMP framework and products less than 10 years later. And then they showed up as DMPs. And when I was at Disney, I ended up being a client and onboarding Blue Kai, which is one of the biggest DMPs that was out there at the time. And I really understood the technology very quickly because I had worked as an executive in the team at Yahoo. So I don't know if that's something that resonates with you.
I mean, I think about timing, and you have these examples of like, you know, in the late 90s as a teenager, watching things like Webvan explode in the dot-com bust.
Right.
And then many years later, you know, seeing what happens when you have a mobile device with the capacity of an iPhone. Webvan wasn't a bad idea. You know, maybe the timing was bad, to your point. I think we talked about this in the prior episode. Joe Schreiber, a friend of ours, who's the first UX hire at Google. And we talked about going through these like compute paradigm shifts from like the web to mobile. And now everyone's buzzing about metaverse and AR, VR. If we're all wearing 3D glasses in 2 or 3 years, how might that change some of the ideas from 10 or 20 years ago? Because there's probably going to be some new things that maybe the timing wasn't right before, but with some new compute paradigm, maybe the timing will be better.
Even 10 years ago, right? So 10 years ago, it was all about QR codes. So everyone was talking about QR codes. You need to have a QR code. And then it got to a point where when you see it has a business that had a QR code, you're like, what is the point of the QR code? Well, COVID changed all of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
The use of the QR code and the digital device and how ubiquitous that has come in the restaurant and bar industry or any other services that are using QR codes, they become essential. It's just what is old is new always. And I think you're right about the glasses, actually. And I think that we're going to see an explosion now in the use of headsets, but it may not be in the way that we think it is. It's going to evolve. VR is going to really evolve very quickly now. I have a very good friend who she's done serial startups in the gaming space, and she has a company called Tripp, which the product is really using VR experiences for depression, for mental health, and it's been extremely successful. They've been working on this for a few years, but they've now really, hit their stride. Yeah, that's another example, right? It's just going to evolve very quickly. And look what happened with streaming and due to COVID as well, right? Everybody's at home, no one could go to the movie theater. And so then suddenly it accelerated movies being released straight to streaming.
Yeah, it was interesting, not just how the technologies come back around, as the circumstances change, but also how the people in the companies, like these new initiatives that came out of what you were working on, how that circled back when you moved to Disney, and then suddenly you're a client of these people you'd been working with before.
Yeah, it's another aspect of the network effect, right? You need a network effect around a product to make it successful, but then you also need a network effect in your community to build relationships, do business, hire talent, right?
Yeah, you need a network effect around your product and your business and yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
That really resonates with me. I come to really appreciate being able to work with people that I built a trusting relationship with. Also, just seeing people who can execute. When you work
Yeah.
in the world, there's a lot of people who make promises and underdeliver, and they don't really hold up to their commitments. And so, I think reputation really is earned, and I think that's why I think the network effects of kind of building a career around relationships, at least, certainly resonates a lot with me.
Everybody enjoys working on a mission together and getting things done. And I think if you are able to work in a team, you've got a harmonious bond together, you're getting products out the door, you're getting things done, you have a mutual feeling of success together. Then when you leave that experience, you go work in other places. My experience is that I have maintained those bonds and those relationships with people through the course of my career, and they still call me. We call each other, we refer each other, we advise each other. I don't know how I could exist in my career without that, right? I mean, the fact that you and I and Ryan worked together, over 15 years ago now, and we're still connected and can call each other. And, I think it's a pretty good, easy conversation, right? We have
Mhm.
we have a trusted relationship. So it's absolutely critical. It's all about having good, positive relationships with people.
Yeah, I think we talked about that. I can't remember which episode, but someone was talking about like recruiting. Maybe that was also the Joe Shriver episode, who was at Google, and how one of the things he observed in the Bay Area was how you had these like clusters of people in like product and engineering teams kind of going from company to company, but together, because the company was kind of less important to them than just the who they worked with. And I think that was kind of an interesting thing when if you're scaling a business really fast, if you get a certain group of people, they'll probably help bring other talented people.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Are you both familiar with the Maya Angelou quote, which is, maybe nobody will remember exactly what you say, but they will remember how you made them feel? There's such a huge conversation now. Everybody took time and took stock of their lives during the pandemic and during COVID to evaluate what they want to do. And people absolutely do not want to be working in toxic work environments, right? So it's very important to have, first of all, for yourself, a good understanding of what you want as an employee and what kind of relationships you want to have with people around you. And then as a manager and a leader, you really have to have an empathetic perspective when it comes to working with people, understanding every individual situation. People are not going to want to work in toxic workplaces. So I just think it's really important for managers to think about how they make people feel, right? When they're working together on a day-to-day basis. It's just critical.
As a leader at like a big company or at a startup, do you have any input for people who might be leaders when it comes to setting a great company culture?
I actually think that there's a lot that big corporate cultures have learned from startups. There's many different examples, but one of the things where it has impacted us in a very positive way is the importance of offering people flexibility. It seems to have been easier to create more flexible working environments for people in startups, but it has allowed bigger employers to offer the same flexibility to their employees as well. In fact, I would say it's really influenced a lot of the ways big corporates work now. And big corporates want to offer these different types of tools because they're competing for talent in the same marketplace. The one thing that I would say, though, that's maybe easier for a larger company with more funding or more infrastructure is to be able to provide all the functions like training and people and culture programs. So managers are taught how to lead and manage people, what's acceptable to do, what not to do. I know that there isn't that type of infrastructure typically in a startup right away. So if it's all down to one leader and they're not really thinking through how people are feeling burned out or ignored or not valued, morale, I know, can plummet pretty quickly. We could think about that as just what's been happening during COVID, right? With everyone working at home, we had to think about how we reinvented meetings, make them shorter so that people weren't getting completely burned out. So we went back into exploring what we've learned over the years in tech development, which is doing stand-ups. So instead of having a 1 hour meeting, in-person meeting, normally in the office, you do a 15-minute stand-up instead of sticking these 1 hour meetings on the calendar, giving people short breaks between meetings so that they're not getting that Zoom burnout. So that's one example of leadership. The other thing I will say is that there's been research, and not just the Zoom burnout, but it's being on camera versus being on audio. And particularly for women, there is some research that was showing that not everyone wants to be on camera all the time. I think women do feel a pressure in particular to look good. And I do think as a leader, it's important to show the way and say, if you don't want to be on camera, you don't have to be on camera. You can have your camera switched off. And once you're participating in the call and you're actively engaging, that's fine. I think that's the type of leadership we need to show up with today. I don't know, Rob, what about you? What's going on in the startup world?
Well, I have to say, for us, when we have a portfolio of something like 30 companies, I think, early on, I've always been fairly flexible in my approach. So I would let the founders kind of guide how they wanted communication to flow a little bit. But then over time, I start to feel, where was communication, being managed the most effectively. And what I found, like, I'll use board meetings as an example. The best boards that I'm on for startups have like a 1 hour monthly call. There's not a lot of heavy-handed governance when you're in a startup usually. You're being agile, you're responding to customer feedback, you're constantly thinking about prioritization with limited resources. I found like the best run boards for startups are usually kind of that kind of monthly cadence where it's 1 hour, check in, talk about where you've been, where you're going, versus like maybe the more typical like mid-market board meeting is like 3 hours once a quarter, 4 hours once, or maybe all day. And it's just not effective especially, this is, I think, also part of being just remote. I think it's much better to have more frequent, shorter check-ins, at least as an investor working with a startup.
And you lose people's attention, right?
Mm-hmm.
You lose people's attention, especially if, I have been on all day like you. I have been on all day QBRs. Those are tough. Those are tough days, right?
Yeah.
And I assume that I am not the only person that finds that to be a tough day. I just don't know how on Zoom everybody can be focused for a full day. That's a tough one.
Mm-hmm. Kind of going in a different direction. I know your current role, you're kind of leading analytics. And I know when we worked together while you were at Yahoo, in digital advertising, analytics are so much, and performance are so tied together that it's hard to find a digital media or digital advertising kind of business or product that isn't really analytics or strong from an analytics standpoint, or probably wouldn't be a very good digital media technology or product, right? But when you think about, I guess I'm not as familiar with your work while you were at Disney or not in your current role. How does analytics kind of play a role when you're thinking about scaling digital businesses?
First of all, if you take businesses and particularly for founders that are in the digital space, if you're looking for direction, the companies like Uber, Meta, Netflix, Amazon, Airbnb, their entire business process is mostly is digitized, and so therefore it's mostly trackable. And scaling using analytics in companies like that is a lot easier than doing it in a more traditional business that doesn't have the whole process digitized, maybe like manufacturing or traditional retail or automotive, aerospace, etc. And the reason is that there are still certain elements in those business processes that aren't completely digitized. They have elements that rely on a lot of manual data input. And so in those organizations, there's a huge amount of effort that has to go into harmonizing all of the data, streamlining processes to go with that, And even then, and now this is all rapidly changing as we're having this conversation, because companies such as Amazon, they're reliant on AI processes to provide services, and the traditional world is transitioning to that too.
So what kind of practical advice do you have for founders who really want to be data driven and like build that into their startup?
Good question. I think, first of all, the term data driven from the outset, or creating a data driven culture, really what that means is, are you using the right information to make the best decision possible? A startup founder might be thinking, well, there's only two of us here. What does that mean? It means that you have to bring the data to any discussion, any stand-up, any meeting when you're getting together. If you're having stand-ups talking about how many customers you've signed up, or something that's going on with your software development lifecycle, or anything, any kind of tracking, if you're not taking that tracking data to a stand-up and you're not using reporting or data points when you're having a discussion, that's an issue. I mean, I've been in organizations where everyone's talking about how we become data-driven as a culture, and yet no one is bringing a report into a meeting, and looking at the data. So it turns into a conversation more about gut feelings and things like that. When you or your team are encountering a problem, do you look at the numbers to find solutions and validate assumptions? And if not, you need to be embedding that into the heart of your culture. That's number one. Number two, using data to drive decision making. So when you use analytics to understand exactly how your customers interact with your product, and you're able to see clearly where are they finding value and where is there friction, where are you getting a lot of maybe emails or customer service issues with products, the right data will allow you and your team to always focus on the most important problems and opportunities, and whether you're measuring the right things. So for example, if you've built a streaming product and you are not able to have that delivered into an environment on a real-time basis, so you can't really troubleshoot a problem because that's something that's happening in real time, that's a big gap, right? Using self-service analytics to make data accessible. So your problems are going to get solved faster when the information is flowing really freely. And if you don't have the skill set to build that for yourself, for example, your mobile app data, maybe you've got push notifications, maybe you've got a bunch of different processes that are tracking data around your mobile app experience, and they're in different places, or maybe they're with third-party tools, and you're struggling to bring that together and look at that. Maybe you're going into different tools to look at different things. The freelance economy, you should be able to get a SQL analyst to pull that together and pull some backbone reporting. So it's easy to develop and you can get the information when you need it. It's not holding you back. You're spending hours manually pulling reporting together. That's just something that you could easily outsource, and you shouldn't be doing that yourself. So you've got data, then you've got reporting and analytics. Typically reporting and analytics I can join together, but then you need to, then there's the so what moment. So with the right tools, you can look through your customer data and other information to find correlations that can be used to find maybe some pockets of growth or areas you're overlooking. So that's what I would call insights, right? So for example, do you feel you understand who your ideal customers are? Do you have the data to support that? And if the answer is no, the process of backing up some assumptions with data could be really eye-opening. It could be something as simple as you're going to launch a survey, ask a variety of questions, put that data together, and then compare that with what you're actually seeing with customer buying patterns. Put it together, and then now you've got some insights that allow you to validate how your customers are interacting with your product. And maybe that's going to open the door to opportunities that you weren't aware of. So creating that data-driven decision-making culture is not a one-step move. It's kind of multiple steps along the way. And it really is a mindset. So it's just, always thinking about the data points, how it's informing you moving forward, that you're able to get it quickly, that you're able to parse it out quickly. Those are the types of things that you want, really.
when you think about, what does it take to build a strong startup community, or because you've been a part of some really strong startup communities.
Well, I guess I have been, even though I have a really strong corporate experience, I was exposed to the startup community in Ireland probably, more than 10 years ago when I founded a coding academy solution for kids here in Los Angeles. And we were connected to, it was a grassroots organization that came out of Southern Ireland and called Coder Dojo. And so another friend of mine and I, we set that up here in Los Angeles, and we just started to get really connected with the tech community in Ireland because of that, the startup tech community. And we're over 5,000 miles apart between the West Coast and Ireland, but we had Twitter, so we just started to get to know all these different people on Twitter, and that's how I discovered that Ireland, it's a small and very tight community. So the tech community is extremely strong and very tight. And then there are people there who've been worked as engineers, either in startups or maybe in larger corporates. And then they left and they went and they did a startup. And once you have that community of people who are encouraging people, supporting each other, then there are also several people who have been very successful. And so as they came out of there, similar to what you're doing, they set up VC, and venture groups and supported and mentored other startup leaders. So Ireland has this very, very, very strong networked people. I mean, Irish are great networkers anywhere. I mean, pretty much live all over the world and we stay connected. And then it's irresistible when you meet another Irish person. You say, okay, do you know Rob, and what town does he come from? And I know the person's mother, I know the father, I went to college with this person. So we're just like always, constantly networking. But I think the other thing that put Ireland on the map was, the creation of Web Summit came out of Dublin with the work that Paddy Cosgrave did. And now it's obviously moved to Lisbon. But Web Summit has such an incredible reach across the world. I mean, it brings startups from all over the world, and it has really created a hub at a huge global scale, right? So where Ireland was sort of at the epicenter of that. So that's, to me, a success story of what can happen in a network. Obviously, I'm also part of the Digital Media Network. I'm part of an entertainment and media network. And then when I had a great opportunity to go back and work in London a few years ago. I was there for 3 years with Disney, met a whole new group in the media space there in London. And now there's, I feel that connection, much stronger connection between London and LA. So it's just amazing to be able to get the opportunity to continue building those communities, right, throughout your career.
Yeah, it kind of, I don't know, it reminds me of this book I read by Brad Feld over at Foundry Group called Startup Communities. And he kind of went to talk about the different stakeholders in communities as sometimes universities, service providers, so think accountants and lawyers, whatever. But sort of Brad says very clearly in the book, he thinks that startup communities are best led by entrepreneurs. And I kind of read that and I got, no, I've never heard anyone say that, but I think that's right on. Thinking of like, here in Minnesota, a group of friends started a group called Ministar. And one of the first things they did was launch kind of an unconference called a bar camp called Minibar. Minibar is the largest bar camp, I think, in the U.S. as far as we know. Each spring, a few thousand people will get together and we'll have 10 different people speaking on different technical and entrepreneurial kind of related topics concurrently. Everyone can register to speak. You're awarded a room size based on how many people pre-register to join your talk. But it's like the most inspiring day. I can stay current from real practitioners on topics related to design, to, data science, entrepreneurship, raising money. I mean, almost any topic. That was started just grassroots by a couple of entrepreneurs who just said, they also started doing like a demo event where we would just start showing like a demo of what we were working on. No PowerPoints, just show off your software. It started around like a table. And now the thing is so big, this Ministar, there's like 30,000 plus tech enthusiasts. It's almost like grown too big where it's not like intimate like it was.
No, I think that's right. I think once these things get really big, it is hard to maintain that energy. But I do think when you're getting people together, it's great to have a lot of diverse topics that you can focus on. There's one particular company that I worked at who also will remain nameless, but they would organize a day once every year for all of the engineering, creative people. I mean, a lot of people in the company, and the range of topics that was covered on this one day was just so fascinating. And there was no PowerPoint used. It was just all panel conversations or talking presentations, but it was across culture, from, music to film to technology to politics, science. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And I remember one day going to one of these events, and my head was exploding from absorbing all of these different experiences. It was mind-boggling how you could get all of that culture in one day.
Yeah, it kind of gets you out of your comfort zone when you had the chance to kind of dive into all these areas that you weren't even aware of, or that are it can be really inspiring, I think.
When it comes to community building, that point about it having to be led by entrepreneurs, that's really interesting, because there's a lot of government and a lot of nonprofit involvement, because they want to see that economic value creation. They want to see that money coming in. They want to see that value creation, the job creation that comes with startups, with new small businesses, especially technology-led ones that could be around, that could be creating the next big industry for a location.
I do think that there's some well-intended efforts that start in certain cities because they're trying to create business. They're trying to create, new economies for their community, which I'm actually in favor of, right? I mean, if there are special tax credits or tax incentives or what have you that only government officials can create or city officials can create in a particular city in order to create a startup economy, I think that's always a good thing. And particularly when we see what happened in 2021, obviously the big cities like in the United States, New York and Silicon Valley in particular, has always been the startup hub, right? Where the majority of venture-backed companies begin. And same in New York. But last year, I think it was one of the first year in several years that out of all of the venture money in the US, there's been a slight decline in Silicon Valley, and it's going to other cities. So now you see Miami popping up, Los Angeles popping up. And I do think that there are some cities that have had venture money due to mayors or city officials basically saying we're going to make this a priority. So once they're creating the environment for people to get the support that they need to create a startup, but yes, you need the entrepreneurs. You can't do it without them, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's a balance, and I don't know if anybody's perfectly figured it out. And of course, the goal's changing every time, right? As technology develops, just like QR codes came back around, And who would have thought 10 years ago we'd be doing this right now via Zoom?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, Una, because I remember exactly feeling the way you did about QR codes 10 years ago, and now it's so ubiquitous. It's like, oh, QR code, this is going to save me a lot of time. It used to be like a complete negative, and now it's actually just a part of life.
So I like to ask every single guest that we have on the podcast, Una, what's a company or a person? Maybe it's someone who's been operating under the radar, or maybe it's somebody that everybody knows, like in your case, Disney. What is somebody or a company that you really see executing right now?
Oh, yes. Actually, I mentioned her earlier. Person who's in my network, the founder and CEO, her name is Nanea Reeves, and she started a startup, which is essentially it's a wellness platform. And it's all about delivering wellness solutions into either companies, hospitals, clinics, and the individual consumer. And what you're doing is you're using an interactive VR headset with experiences developed specifically for wellness and mental health. Nanea comes from the gaming. She worked at EA. She was at EA for several years. She successfully sold a startup to Sony. she's had a lot of different leadership experiences, either in corporate or in the startup world. And she's been very successful in the startup world. I know Nanea really well because female technology leaders, we all try to support each other and prop each other up. And actually, when I was running the coding startup, was also really a great mentor during that time and helped us, providing space for us to educate kids in her workspace and so on. So she's always been super supportive. As we were talking about earlier, that this could be used as a wellness, device and solution. And they've been really successful. They're getting a lot of traction. They have, partnerships, I think, with all the VR companies, and she's someone to look out for. And so check it out. It's called Tripp, Tripp.
That sounds great. I'll be sure to link Tripp in the article about this podcast episode so people can follow through and check it out. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Una.
Oh, it was a pleasure. I really enjoyed coming. Thanks for inviting me, and can't wait to hear what it sounds like.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Una. Appreciate it.